Hey guys, how you going? Hope you're all doing very well. This afternoon I have yet another movie review, so hopefully you find this one interesting. This movie is a horror anthology from the USA, UK and Spain. This is majority in English language, but there's a segment in the Spanish language with English subs. Released in the year 2015, directed by a whole host of directors. You have Brian Doughton, Joseph Graham, Manuel Marin, Lee Matthews, Douglas Connor and Ignacio Martin Lerma, and this movie is called The Horror Network. So The Horror Network consists of 5 tales. These tales are, the first segment is a woman who is in her home at night. She receives a mysterious phone call and she starts to believe that she's in danger. The second segment is of a psychiatrist dealing with a patient that can't sleep. The third segment is a girl who's waiting to be picked up from school, but then she's confronted by a mysterious man in a blue van. The fourth segment is domestic violence and the vicious cycle that these victims find themselves in. And then the last segment, to cap off the experience, is of a priest who has very sadistic habits. And so that all that concludes into what makes this movie. And if you want to know how each story unfolds, is something you're going to have to find out for yourself, because that's as far as I'm going with my synopsis. Now my thoughts on The Horror Network. I didn't really have any expectations coming into this movie, and after seeing the trailer I didn't really think I was going to like it. So when I saw it on the shelf, it was a blind buy. It wasn't very expensive, so I'm not really taking a risk, but I like horror anthologies, and when they're done well they can actually be very unique. And so that was the hope I had coming into it, is that hopefully, you know, this is a movie that was going to impress me, is that that's something that I could really recommend to everybody. And after watching the film, I will say that although it does have some brilliant qualities, overall I thought it was a very lackluster horror anthology, and that was probably a good reason as to why it really hasn't been talked about. Now, it is low budget, but I will say that the production of the movie is actually quite impressive, is that they use the low budget to their advantage. It gives it the griminess, it gives it the filthy sort of feeling that the Horror Network has. And I think that's what each story has in common, is that it's a very nasty experience, and that nastiness is intensified through the cheapest sort of visuals. And so it was very competently made. I thought each and every one of these directors does have a talent and does have ability, but I thought that it was just really inconsistent, because some segments were brilliant, but other segments just felt as though they lacked the punch. And so when you have that inconsistency, it's a very disjointed experience, and overall, as an overall piece, I came away from it feeling a little bit disappointed. And I was thinking that if the other segments were as good as the last 2 segments of this movie, I thought that it could have been an absolutely brilliant masterpiece as far as horror anthology is concerned. So the first story is about this woman who believes that she's been stalked, and she receives these really strange phone calls, and I thought the production in that was actually quite good. It was very subtle, very psychological, and actually quite creepy. And then you've got the second segment. Now the second segment I thought was very dialogue based, and there was only 2 characters in this, and so I thought the exchanges between these characters, it gets creepier and creepier. And then it comes into the third story of this girl who believes that this very strange man in a blue van might be out to hurt her, and that was a game of cat and mouse, and I thought, alright, well, that was fairly decent. And then you've got the fourth segment. Now the fourth segment absolutely blew me away. This is from Spain, Spanish language, and it was a movie, a segment about domestic violence and the vicious cycle of domestic violence, and I thought this was one of the best horror short stories that I've ever seen, is because it gets to the basis and it really doesn't need to expand itself. And so this movie is incredible. This segment is incredibly cruel, it's incredibly thought-provoking, it's heartbreaking, it's just really, really depressing, and it's very, very extreme. There is some sexual violence, there's absolutely horrific violence against this poor mother, and it basically shows you the power of domestic violence and the vicious cycle that these victims find themselves in, and to the outsider how easy it seems to get away from this violence, but they don't really understand. And so if you're coming into it with an ignorant sort of point of view, how damaging that can be as well. So I was absolutely amazed by how good this Spanish segment was. Macarena Gomez, who is a very good Spanish actress, she does a phenomenal job in this role as the daughter of this mother, and I just thought it was incredibly upsetting. And so if you're not used to really extreme sort of horror movies, then you're going to be really upset by this segment that is called, I believe it's Merry Little Christmas. And so I thought that was absolutely brilliant. And then the last segment was a very strange one. It was about this priest, and it was in black and white, and it was silent, so there was no dialogue, but I thought it really got to its basis as well. And that was the shortest of all segments, but I thought that I didn't really need to know anymore. So the last 2 segments of this movie were absolutely phenomenal, and that there leads to my problems, is that the first 3, they had qualities that I really liked, but they just didn't really go anywhere. They didn't have the confidence of the last 2. So the first story, I thought, alright, well, this is building to something really good, and then it finishes, and I thought, well, was that it? And then the second segment was actually better than the first one, but it still had problems. I just just thought it struggled to kick into gear. And then the third segment wasn't as good as, it wasn't better than the second segment. And so, although it was a continuation in quality from the first to the second segment, it kind of stalled in the third segment, is because I thought, alright, well, it was decent, but I still wanted a lot more. And then the fourth segment hits you, and it hits you so hard, and you think to yourself, wow, where was this hiding? Why wasn't this in the first segment, and why wasn't it just continuing on from that? And I just thought that the fourth and the last segment really steal the show, but unfortunately it's a little bit too late. And I just thought to myself, if these first three stories were anywhere near the last two stories, I thought this could have been a masterpiece. Is because I just thought I was hit so hard and I was just numb after watching it, especially that Spanish segment. But unfortunately, I felt as though I was kind of asleep. I was in a little bit of a slumber coming up to that Spanish segment, and then I just thought, alright, well, wow, where was this all along? Is that okay? It doesn't really feel like a consistent horror film, and to me, it's just two directors in the last segments that was so much better than the first three, and as a horror anthology, it just feels very disjointed and it doesn't really come together very well. And so that was the biggest problem coming into it. But if you are a horror anthology fan, maybe you will like it, but I will recommend this movie just for that Spanish segment. Is that was absolutely incredible. It was brilliant. As far as short horror films are concerned, horror anthology segments are concerned, that was a masterpiece of a segment. I loved it, and I would recommend it just for that. And the last segment as well was actually quite horrific. And so two segments within basically a 5 segments film, it doesn't really come together very well, but it still has moments of brilliance. And so overall, for the Horror Network, going to give it 2.5 stars based on the fact that the last 2 stories are so good, but the first 3, they weren't terrible, but they just lacked the punch, they lacked the execution that the last 2 had. Alright guys, that's it for my review. Hope you enjoyed it. Till next time, keep watching movies, and I'll see you later.